Well, good afternoon or morning if you're joining from the West Coast, and welcome to the 15th and final event in our Outcomes Estimation Tools Training webinar series. This time, we are featuring the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, ACPF, which is once again not an outcomes estimation tool, but a framework for agricultural watershed management to identify site-specific opportunities where conservation practices can be prioritized across small HUC 12 watersheds. So thank you for being here today. I'm Aysha Tapp Ross, Water and Soil Health Scientist for American Farmland Trust, and I'm joined by my colleague, research scientist Jen Tillman. For those of you who don't know, American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit founded in 1980. Our mission is to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land and preparing for the next generation of farmers. For today's webinar, after a few reminders and a quick poll to see who's in the room, we'll hear from Nardi, Communications Manager of the Conservation Professional Training Program and North Central Region Water Network, University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, who will give us an introduction to ACPF. Then, Dr. Haleigh Summers, Agricultural Geospatial Data Scientist with the Sand County Foundation, will give us a brief overview and demonstration of how ACPF is used. And finally, Gregg Hadish, a state GIS specialist with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service for Iowa, will go over how NRCS uses ACPF, after which we'll have a brief Q&A period. And we want to thank our funders, the EPA Office of Water, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Mosaic Foundation for making this webinar series possible. Now for some quick housekeeping reminders. We are using Zoom webinar platform for this series, so as attendees, you will have your camera and microphones turned off throughout the event. You can use Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time to ask questions, and the speakers will answer the questions during the last 15 minutes of the event. You can use your name or be anonymous when asking questions or making comments. We also do have the capability to unmute you, so please indicate if in the question if you would like to ask it yourself. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can direct message Jen and she will try to assist you. Following each webinar, you'll receive an email on Monday that will provide the recording and the slides for the presentations, as well as the next steps we will discuss at the end of today's webinar. And by this Friday, we will post the recordings to the webinar registration page, which we absolutely welcome you to share with your colleagues and friends. So in a moment, we will be sharing a link to a 6-question evaluation survey, which you can choose to answer anonymously. That should take you about 2 minutes to complete. The survey will pop up when you leave, but you can also click on it now so it opens in a new tab on your browser. We ask that you please complete the survey right after the event ends. Our presenters and the AFT team rely on these surveys to help influence future events by AFT and our speakers. We are also offering an incentive for completing the survey. Everyone who fills out a survey today before 6 p.m. Eastern will be entered to win a $25 Visa gift card. The winner will be notified by email tomorrow morning, and we appreciate your participation and wish you luck in the drawings. So now Jen will go ahead and start the polls so that we can see who is in the room for this event. The poll asks question 1 is, which one sector best reflects your occupation? Are you with a government agency, a non-government organization, an academic institution, a corporation or environmental markets firm, or other? Question 2 is, if there are 4 types of audience members, if there are 4 types of audience members, which one best describes you? Are you a developer of outcomes estimation tools, methods, or models, a current user of outcomes estimation tools, methods, or models, a potential future user of outcomes estimations tools, methods, or models, or a person interested in learning about outcome estimation tools and issues? And then finally, what is your experience level with ACPF? Had not heard of it but never used it, heard of it and used it, or I refer to it often. So we are going to let, we usually like to get up to about 90% participation in the poll so we can get an accurate representation of who is here. Oh, looks like we just have a couple more people left. So we'll end the poll as soon as, give it just a few more seconds. All right. So we're going to go ahead and share the results. So it looks as though, once again, most everybody here is with a government agency, 66% of you, and then followed by a non-government organization. And then we have some others as well. If there are only 4 types of audience, so what audience member are you? Most of you are either a potential future user of outcomes estimation tools or a person interested in learning about outcomes estimation tools. And most of you have not heard of ACPF, whereas the next level down has heard of it but never used it. So we're really happy that you guys are here to learn more about ACPF today. So since this is our final webinar, we thought we would give you a sneak peek of our webinar stats thus far. The average attendance was 74, and that ranged from 57 as the lowest to 113 as our highest attendance. An average of 45 people responded to the polls at each webinar. And from that, most everybody was with a government agency. So just like today, the average was 62%. And then for the second question, we had close to a tie with most people being either current users of outcomes estimation tools or potential future users. And then for the third question, again, they're very close. 40% had not heard of and 47% heard of, but had never used the tools that were being featured in that webinar. And then for the survey, we had an average of 17 respondents for each webinar to our surveys, and that ranged from 5 to 30. And from those questions, 65% were either likely or very likely to use the tool following the webinar presentation. And then we also asked a question if you are a current user of the tool or method, which best describes the reason for using it. Well, 57% were not currently users of the tool, but of those that were users of the tool, 20% were using the tool in a professional capacity. And if you would like a greater assessment of the webinar statistics, please visit us at SWCS in a few weeks, the Soil and Water Conservation Society conference in a few weeks, where I'll be presenting on the preliminary results of the webinar series and its effects on the outcomes estimation reporting. And so many of you may recognize this page. This is our registration page. You can go here to find all of our recordings of all of our past webinars, including our last webinar, which was the CAST tool for water quality. Now, since this is our final webinar, this page will not be active for much longer. So we do encourage you to utilize this page. This is our farmland information page for the Outcomes Tools Training webinar series. And this is where all of our recorded webinars are housed, as well as the PDFs from those webinars for those of you that like to scroll through the PDFs instead of watching an hour and a half YouTube video. So we do encourage you to hold on to that link, which I do believe Jen shared in the chat earlier. Okay. Yeah, okay. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Anne.
All right, great. Thanks so much for joining today. We're going to talk about the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. And for those who may not be familiar with it, we needed another acronym in our lives. So it is ACPF that we're often talking about. Aysha did mention it's not an outcomes estimation tool, but actually if you pay close attention to Haleigh and what she's got to say, you'll find a little hidden outcomes estimation tool in there. So while that's not the main purpose, there is an add-on tool that does that. So I'm going to talk a little bit, if you could advance the slide. This is just who I am, who the heck I am talking to you. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Division of Extension. My background is in science communication. So I'm really covering the training and outreach and resources to help make the ACPF usable. I work on the ACPF. I also work with the North Central Region Water Network and several other branded programs that are focused on water quality, conservation, and soil health. Go to the next slide. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. I'll be talking about what is the ACPF, especially for those that haven't heard of it, which I know is about half of you, where you can find training and resources. Haleigh's going to probably spend the bulk of the time really talking about how to use it, where you find the data, and some examples, as well as guidance on creating your own core data for it. I'll talk a little bit about what core data is in a moment. And then Gregg's going to talk about how NRCS is incorporating ACPF results into their workflows. So what is the ACPF? The ACPF is, we talk about it as a framework for agricultural conservation. It is a free ArcGIS tool and a free toolbox. So that's where it's really using the power of geospatial data. And what it's going to do is allow you to make site potential conservation practices, particularly structural conservation practices. Yeah, thanks, Haleigh. So it really is a visual tool that's going to allow for watershed planning, both at the landscape or community scale, because it is at the HUC 12 level, but also can be done at the field scale as well. One of the things that really allows for is that creativity. And it is a ArcGIS toolbox that folks with intermediate ArcGIS knowledge can run. And then it also produces maps, that's the visual component of it, that can be used by watershed and conservation planners without GIS expertise to really visualize how how conservation can make an impact, visualize where conservation actions can be installed to have the greatest impact. As well as make those decisions, make those trade-offs about what's going to make sense where in order to meet watershed-wide goals. So I mentioned that it's an ArcGIS tool. There is core data in there. And so this is a map of where there is core data. So you can see where are you located in relation to this map. This core data is the soils and land use data that goes into the ACPF. Along with the digital elevation model. And that is the two kind of components of the data that then allow you to run the ACPF. So it's going to be a lot easier to run the ACPF if you're in those states, but you can create ACPF core data for areas. If you aren't in one of those states, don't worry, it can be created. Haleigh's going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's another step to add on. So I mentioned that it's a ArcGIS tool. So in terms of who can run the tool, it does take intermediate to advanced GIS knowledge, and it does take the Esri's ArcGIS platform. So if you are a user of ArcGIS, you're in luck, you can run the ACPF for yourself. If not, there are a number of technical consultants who can run the ACPF, or I know many organizations, especially I know many of you are government organizations, have in-house GIS specialists who could run this. There's also another user, which is folks that use the ACPF results, as we say. So those are often these maps that we're talking about that you can see in the picture there. And so these are folks that are really working at watershed level or conservation planners, resource managers, and they can be from all over, whether it is the government agency or, you know, your soil and water conservation district, your local watershed group, or farmers and landowners themselves that can look at the field scale and say, where is a conservation practice going to make sense for my land? We also put researchers and scientists in there as well, because it can really add that scientific validity to many grant proposals and work there when we're saying, okay, we need funds to implement conservation practices to reach our goals. And this is really the tool providing that to say, these are the practices that are going to get us there. Next slide. In terms of watershed planning, we have like a lot of different resources on our website, so I'll often point to that. But this is a graphic that's going to talk about how the ACPF really fits into the EPA's 9 key element watershed planning, which I'm assuming many of you are very familiar with. And I know it's a lot of different colored lines there, but really it's saying, okay, these are the 9 steps in the blue blocks, and you can see how many different ways the ACPF, how many different lines there are that said ACPF can help with that process along the way, depending on how you use it and what's been run for the area. So it can be used to understand watershed hydrology and critical conservation issues. It can be used to cite the tools themselves and provide a catalog of practice opportunities. I mentioned strengthening funding proposals, which is certainly something we see a lot. It can also be used to kind of talk about priorities and implementation goals and trade-offs using those maps that are generated from the ACPF. And also we see it as a key avenue in terms of building partnerships or comparing actual implementation to the opportunities that are identified. So next slide, just a little bit about who we are and how we're organized. ACPF is a free tool. It was originally developed out of USDA, the ARS, Mark Tomar, David James, and team out of the National Environmental Ag Laboratory. Currently, we have a national hub, which is partners from the University of Minnesota, Iowa State, University of Wisconsin, and many others, including Sand County Foundation and NRCS, who are presenting with us today, to say it's a national hub that is really created with the goal of serving NRCS offices. So if you're with NRCS, we have a goal of serving you, but also other partners across the state to say, okay, how can we maintain, update? We just created a new version of ACPF, so we're constantly trying to improve that, providing that outreach and training, as well as cultivating a network of ACPF users. So there is this network behind the ACPF to support it, and much of the information about that is available on our website, ACPF4 watersheds.org. The next slide is my final slide here, and I think this is probably one of the ones for folks who aren't aware of ACPF before today's call that you want to be aware of. This is a map called the ACPF in Action Map. It is on the homepage of our website, and I encourage you to look it up. Everywhere in red that you can see there is where the ACPF has already been run. So if you don't have ArcGIS experience, or if you don't have an in-house GIS specialist, these are watersheds where it's already been run and could be used within your watershed planning as a result. So you can see it as a lot of folks in Iowa are in luck as it was developed in Iowa, but there are many other pockets where it has been run and those outputs can be used. It's not to say that it can't be run for other areas. We showed the core data, and really anywhere that's an agricultural watershed could be used. Some examples are on the screen here. It's been used multiple places in Iowa, as I mentioned, because that's where it was really created, as well as part of the Iowa's state nutrient reduction strategy. But there are also examples in Indiana, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and we have use examples for that on our website, as well as there's been many publications about that. I know Aysha mentioned Soil and Water Conservation Society. There's multiple articles in there kind of talking about the theory behind ACPF, as well as its use in watershed and conservation planning. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Haleigh to talk more about what goes into running the ACPF.
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, my name is Haleigh Summers. I'm an agricultural geospatial data scientist at Sand County Foundation. And if you haven't heard of Sand County Foundation before, we're a national nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and the environment. We're based on the works of Alda Leopold, based in Madison, Wisconsin, but we have staff all over the US. So I'm based in Ames, Iowa, where I finished my degree. I just finished my PhD last summer in sustainable agriculture and environmental science, and ACPF was something I was in almost every day, working with a tool, figuring out how we could use those outputs to think about where conservation is going across the state of Iowa, And then I've started kind of tweaking around and developing my own tools to add onto the ACPF, which will hopefully be added in the next couple of months. Before that, I was at Penn State getting a master's in agronomy and then a bachelor's in agronomy and seed science from Iowa State. Some projects that I'm working on with Sand County Foundation, we just had received an RCPP, the Regional Conservation Protection Program, for advancing farmer-led incentives in the Midwest. So we're really excited about funding farmer-led groups to do conservation. And that's going to be in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Dubuque County, Iowa, or Illinois, Wisconsin, and Dubuque County, Iowa. As I mentioned, I developed my own tool looking at subfield profitability in the state of Iowa when I was at Iowa State, and I'm hoping to incorporate that into ACPF here in the next couple of months. We have some funding to do that. And finally, some of you on this call might have heard of this, or if you haven't, you should definitely look it up. Sand County Foundation holds the Leadership for Midwestern Watersheds, which is a group of watershed planners and conservation planners getting together to share ideas. We do a meeting about once a year, and it's a great way to network with others in this conservation planning space. And I know we were supposed to talk about hobbies, so here's my dog Sadie, and she's fantastic. And then I'm also on the board of the Iowa Farmers Union, so that's something that keeps me pretty busy. So Anne's already mentioned a couple of these things, but I just want to go over a snapshot summary of the ACPF. This looks pretty similar to the same slide you've seen a dozen times with this webinar series, so you can stack them all up and look at these together. As Aysha mentioned, this is not an outcomes estimation tool. ACPF is really a planning framework, and it's there to help you plan, and I like to think of it as a conversation starter. But we can go into more details about what that means in a minute. So ACPF is run at the HUC-12 watershed scale. But the great thing about this is that you can run multiple HUC-12s and then kind of look at them, and if you want to look at a HUC-10 or if you want to look at a HUC-8, you can combine those together. Or you can run the HUC-12 scale and then look at individual fields if you want to have a conversation with a farmer on the ground. And each location is site specific. So when the ACPF is suggesting, this might be an opportunity for a practice, that's going to be based on the watershed that it's in, how the water is flowing through the landscape, the land use in that area, the soils data, and then the topography in that exact location. So it's very location specific, even though we're running at that HUC-12 scale. Some of the outcomes, and I'll go into more of these later, but it's going to be a file geodatabase or a folder for non-GIS users that contain opportunity locations for conservation practices. So sometimes people will talk about ACPF as a siting tool, and I want to just be clear that it's not meant to say that a contour buffer strip has to go in this exact location. It's a conversation of it could go in this location based on the maps that we have, based on the data available, but you're really going to need a boots on the ground look at in a conversation with a farmer to know if that's actually the case. But it is a good opportunity to say, this might be a good opportunity to go and have a conversation with the farmer. It also has runoff risk ratings for each field, so you can get that at the field scale to understand which fields are going to be more susceptible to runoff and therefore nutrient loss. And then I think starting in version 5, we now have the soil vulnerability index for soil map units or for field level data as well. Conservation practices are mostly going to be structural and field and edge of field practices. So thinking about things that really matter where they're placed in the landscape. So thinking about grass waterways, how is the water flowing through? Contour buffer strips, we want those to intercept water flows. Bioreactors, nutrient removal wetlands, these things that need to intercept water. And so kind of filtering and trapping and treating those water as it moves through with the pollutants. All land uses are evaluated because they're coming from the cropland data layer, but the conservation practices are specifically designed for these agricultural row crop fields. So it was developed in Iowa. We have a lot of corn and soybean fields, but it has been used in other states and looking at other row crop fields. Core ACPF data, which I know we keep saying that core data word, I'll get into a little bit more about what that means, but that's available for Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then parts of Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota. Doesn't mean that you can't use it if you're outside of those areas. It just means you have a few more steps to go through to build that core data structure yourself, rather than getting it directly from the ACPF hub. And ACPF is very time intensive. So it does require GIS experience. It requires someone who knows how to use ArcGIS. And it's helpful to run through it with someone who has knowledge about hydrology. So does this water flow look like it's moving through the landscape appropriately? We tend to say it's about 40 to 50 hours, so a little over a week per HUC 12 watershed to run the data. And that's where results data do not already exist. So Gregg is going to go into what happens if you already have that results data. And that's not including the time to get the core data. So if you need to have that extra step, if you're outside of one of those states where you don't have core data, then that's going to be an additional time restriction that you would need to consider. And the data is going to be provided by you as the user, the ACPF National Hub, and state offices, just depending on what data you need. Again, this is another slide that you've seen throughout this webinar series. So these are the strengths and limitations of ACPF. ACPF is run at the HUC 12 watershed, but you can look at field scale suggestions. And by doing this, you can facilitate targeted conservation. So thinking about where conservation practices could go in the landscape. Supports watershed planning, and by that it identifies high-risk areas and suggests opportunities for practices to alleviate some of those risky areas. It is free to use as long as you have an Esri ArcGIS subscription, which is our first limitation. My favorite thing about the tool, or one of my favorite things being a geospatial data scientist, is the built-in file organization. So when you're running a lot of GIS tools and Esri, you're going to start to, you notice Esri will give you default names, and they're usually not the best default names. And what I love about ACPF is that it already names all of your files for you, so you don't have to worry about organizing your files. And it might seem small, but as a GIS user, it's huge. It's not prescriptive. So I mentioned that this isn't a citing tool, this is a conversation starter. So this tool will say, here's where practices could go. But you get out to the field and you might say, well, yeah, contour buffer strip could go here, but it could also go over here, and that's going to be a lot easier for the farmer to manage this field if we put it over in this area instead. One of my dissertation projects was looking at where unprofitable land was, and could we place ACPF practices in unprofitable land. The visual portrayal of watershed management, so getting that map, getting something that the farmers can actually look at, see their land, see what opportunities are available. That's a great way to have a conversation with farmers. And all of these locations are based on scientific data. So it provides scientific validity to funding opportunities. We're thinking about if we want to write a grant, now we know exactly where practices could go. We know that we're in a watershed where practices could go in the landscape. Some of the limitations, I already mentioned the ArcGIS subscription. It hasn't been tested in every state. And so you need a little bit to run it a little bit more carefully if you're outside of those main core states. It does require GIS and hydrology knowledge, but you are able, I think we have a list on the ACPF website that you can hire people, hire contractors to run the ACPF for you if you're not in one of those locations where it's already been run. And it is very time intensive, again, that 40 to 50 hours per HUC 12 watershed to run. So how does the ACPF work? And instead of going through a demo, we don't have 40 hours to sit on a webinar. I'm going to give some brief overviews of how it's working behind the scenes, what kind of inputs data it uses, so you know what you're getting into if you decide to use it or to contract with someone to use it. And then I'll go through a little bit about how individual steps in the ACPF work and what that might look like before Gregg talks about how you could use that data. So the ACPF is based on principles of agricultural watershed management. And so here we're seeing, I can move my mouse over here. So when we're thinking about pollutants in water, we're thinking about how can we avoid and control those pollutants. And then if they do start to move through the water, we can think about controlling, trapping, or treating those. Those control, trap, or treat methods can be done in the field, below the field, or in the riparian zone. And so the ACPF takes all of these different principles of watershed planning and turns it into practices. So we're thinking about, where is surface runoff going to happen? Well, we might want to think about a grass waterway in that area because that's where the water is forming and that's where gullies may form. And so that's just an example of what the framework is based on. And then if we're thinking about the data that's used for the ACPF, it's always using publicly available geospatial data. So this includes the elevation, the soils, the land use, and showed this picture earlier. These are the core data states where these base layers are already ready to go and ready to use for you. So that's the land use, 6 years of land use and crop history data, the Surgo soils data, the digital elevation map, so that will be dependent. Most states have a website where you can download these digital elevation maps. I know Iowa, and I'll show a map of Iowa or a picture of Iowa later. Iowa's pretty good about that, and the field boundaries. So those are state dependent as well, although those should be in the core data if you already have the core data. And then the HUC 12 watershed boundary is important, and those are USGS derived. I mentioned the land use data is coming from the cropland data layer. So it's the cropscape cropland data layer, and it maps major agricultural commodity crops nationwide. So here you can see what that looks like in the website. And then in the ACPF, that's translated into just general land use terms. So some farms are, I'm sure this is a farm out of Iowa, mostly corn and soybeans, some continuous corn. And then the ACPF is going to capture that down further into 3 land use codes. So either it's row crop agricultural, non-row crop agricultural, or non-agricultural land. And that's just so ACPF, it's easier for ACPF to use that data. The second input is our soils data, and these are coming from the GSurgo database at a 10-meter resolution. So that small resolution scale or the fine resolution scale is really important to use. You can see here just how many soils are in this map, and it is really helpful to use the ACPF data set because all of the soils data is already ready to go, clipped at the watershed boundary. Sometimes using Surgo data is not the easiest to use and find. There's a million tables that you have to go through, and thankfully if you're using the ACPF core data, it's already there. I know there have been other projects that I've done where I've gone and downloaded ACPF core data, even though I'm not using ACPF, just so I could get the soils data in an easy to use format. And then probably one of the most important things is the digital elevation model, or DEM. And so this is really helping us look at the topography, thinking about how the water is flowing through the landscape, and the speed at which the water is flowing, thinking about where gullies might start to form. And so these are a few pictures out of Iowa where we're looking at elevation data, how this translated into mean slope across a field. And then this is a hillshade showing that same area with flow accumulation in red, although that's kind of hard to see. You can see how we expect flow to accumulate. We want to make sure that we're using high resolution digital elevation data for this. We typically say, I think anywhere from 1 to 3 meters is a good resolution for DEMs. But the more fine resolution you can get, the better. Although you also don't want the model to run so slowly that you're going to be waiting, adding an additional week in terms of processing time. So 1 to 3 meters is usually a good idea. So when we add all of these together, we think about our topography, so how the water is flowing, the watersheds, what all land area is actually flowing to that water source, the land use and management, so is this row crop land, perennial land, or non-agriculture, and then the soils data. how resistant is that soil to runoff. All of these can make up our water quality pollution potential. So these are all things that go into thinking about how much water quality pollution we can expect to have in that landscape. So ACPF will take all of those layers, so the watershed boundary, our field boundaries, Surgo soils data, our land use and crop history, and our digital elevation model, and then we'll start running it through the tool. And this is an example of what the ACPF toolbox looks like in ArcGIS Pro. And so we'll go through these 6 steps. There's now 7 with a soil vulnerability index. And finally, you'll have an output, which is the watershed and the field level land use scenarios, or those conservation practices that have been conservation practice opportunities that have been located in the landscape. And here's an example of some of those conservation practices that can be identified, or opportunities that can be identified by the ACPF. So thinking about grass waterways and contour buffer strips or prairie strips, bioreactors, nutrient removal wetlands, saturated buffers are one that's been used quite often, and WASCOPs. So the ACPF can be really beneficial in conservation planning. Anne showed a slide earlier about the NRCS 9-step conservation planning process, or the 9 key element plans. So it's helpful for thinking about where these problem areas are, and then also proposing some solutions. And again, you want to make sure that you're having the boots on the ground conversation with the farmer to actually look at the landscape. But this is a great conversation starter of, hey, there's a problem here. Let's talk about what we can do to fix it, and here are some opportunities that we might be able to use. It also uses adaptive management. So it's not prescriptive. It's not going to say, this is exactly where this practice should go. It says, here's an opportunity for practice in this location. And let's go out to the field and see if that's the case. And also mention some different users of the ACPF, or use examples. And there's a lot of these on the ACPF Hub website. One of my favorite examples, probably just because I'm in Iowa, but if you've heard about the Polk County Batch and Build project, in 2015 to 2019, they had only built 6 saturated buffers, or installed 6 saturated buffers in the county. And they were really excited about getting more saturated buffers out on the ground. Research was coming out of Iowa State at the time saying that this was really great for nitrate reduction. And they wanted to reach their nitrate goals. So they decided to use ACPF to identify locations that were at high risk and also were suitable for saturated buffer installment, because the ACPF will put riparian buffers all along perennial streams, but then it'll also say, this might be a good place for saturated buffers. This might be a good place for just a multi-species riparian buffer. And it also has a way of determining which fields are likely to be tile drained, which is helpful when we're thinking about, I'm in central Iowa in the Des Moines Lobe, so tile drain is very common, but it's helpful to know where those fields might be. So they used ACPF and got some simplified maps, so again, that visual representation, and sent those out to landowners that had suitable field sites. And then they received funding. They served as a fiscal sponsor and hired all the contractors. So the farmers, all they had to do was say, yes, I want a saturated buffer on my land. And in 2021, they installed 51 saturated buffers. And in 2022, they installed 60. So this was a great success story for saturated buffers and using the ACPF. Another example is the Root River watershed in southeast Minnesota. So here they were looking at, they wanted to evaluate how these practices could affect runoff. Then they did, I think, 8 years of 8 years of evaluation and just getting the baseline flow, baseline loads, and used ACPF to understand where these high runoff risk areas are, to see if that matched with what they were seeing in the field, and then also looked at opportunities. Again, they created these maps, simplified those maps, and then they were used as a tool to take with farmers to do field walkovers. So they took those maps to the farmers and had a conservation professional sit down with them and say, okay, here's what we're seeing on the maps. Is there something that we can do to fix it soon? And they were really focused on simplifying the practices and prioritizing areas. This was successful in that 100% of the farmers in the watershed, and I think there was about 50 farmers in this watershed, they all participated in a walkover. So they were all willing to sit down with a conservation professional to talk about what was happening on their land. And in the first 2 years, 70% of these farmers decided to implement a new conservation practice. So again, another successful use case of conservation planning. So now I'll go into a little bit about how to use ACPF. First thing is downloading ACPF. I do have the link here, although if you just go to acpf4watersheds.org, you'll be able to find that. Adding it into the toolbox is a little bit, or adding it, into ArcGIS Pro is a little bit more complicated. So you'll need to add it as a toolbox in your catalog pane. So you'll find all of your toolboxes here. You'll right click and say add toolbox. And then you'll go to where you saved the ACPF toolbox and add this .atbx file. And once you've done that, you now see in your catalog pane, this is your toolbox. And these are all the tools that are available in the ACPF toolbox. So one thing that's a little weird the first time you use ACPF, you're not using the tools in the geoprocessing pane, you're using it directly out of the catalog pane. And I always want to highlight the manual, the user's manual. There's over 100 pages of information in here. And to find that, you go into the folder where you downloaded the ACPF. So right outside this folder is here's our ATBX. So here's where our toolbox is. And if you go into the documents folder, you'll find the user's manual. And that has everything any question you could ever have there. If you have a question, it's probably already been answered in the manual. It has a really great step-by-step walkthrough of, what defaults you should accept, just what you should really think about depending on what landscape you're in. We talked about core data quite a bit, and so here's the website to download ACPF core data. So here you'll add in your name, email, and your organization, and that's just to keep track of who's using ACPF. And then you can scroll in and select watershed or multiple watersheds that you're interested in downloading core data for. And once you download those, this is what that core data looks like. So it's in a folder. Inside that folder is a geodatabase. And this has everything in our core data. And so I mentioned earlier, the file organization is one of my favorite parts of ACPF. And what I meant by that is that every ACPF feature class is named very similarly. So the last 12 digits on every one of these feature classes is the same. It's a 12-digit HUC number. And as you move through the tool, it's always going to keep those last 12 digits. So if you want to run a HUC 10 watersheds, you're going to have multiple HUC 12s. Now you know that everything is still matched with its original HUC 12. So it's just really easy to keep things together. Here's where you'll want to refer to the manual too. So this is the boundary. So the watershed boundary of the HUC 12, the buffer, this is the crop history table, the field boundary. And so to know what B&D stands for, you'll want to go to the manual. So that's what the core data looks like, but you can also build your own core data using the ACPF Utilities Suite. So that's one of the last tools in the toolbox. And this is a way for you to build, grab your field boundaries, get your soils data and your land use data and put it into the same format that ACPF is already used to seeing and recognizes. And so here you can get your ACPF soils data. And I think for that, you just need your buffered watershed boundary, and it'll go directly to the CERCO website, pull the soils data you need at that 10-meter resolution, and put it into a format that ACPF uses. Field boundaries are also really important. So one thing I recommend field boundaries are already available in the core data set. So even if you already have the core data set, I recommend going through and updating the field boundaries yourself. So some field boundaries haven't been updated for a decade. And it's because it's a time-consuming task. So even if you have core data, you should probably still think about updating field boundaries to be as accurate as possible. And once you add in those new field boundaries, it'll you can say, here's a lookup table, so that relates it to the cropland data layer and then puts it in a format that ACPF understands, and that's in the folder. And then you can say what year your field boundaries were updated, just to help you keep track. And so once you do that, that gets you your core file database structure like this, even if you're outside of that core data. One thing the core data doesn't have, but you will need to use, is the digital elevation model. In Iowa, this is pretty easy to download. It's hosted by the ISU GIS facility, and it's already available in HUC 12 boundaries. So it's pretty easy to just go in, select a few watersheds, or select the one watershed that you want to download, and download that, and it'll be ready to go for you. However, you will need to prepare your DEM, and this is the most important step at running ACPF, and probably the most time-consuming as well. So this first step of the ACPF is the DEM preparation. So we're looking at the terrain processing, looking at flows, looking at flow paths. Most of these digital elevation models are based on LiDAR data. And so what that means is that, you know, LiDAR is coming from aerial imagery, or it's uses the same process as aerial imagery. But if you think about where, if you're driving along the road, a lot of areas will have culverts or bridges. And when you're thinking about how that might look to a LiDAR plane, those look like barriers for water to flow, but they're not. There is a cut there where water can flow through. There's a pipe underneath the ground where water can flow through. So this is an example of what that digital elevation model, or how the water is flowing through the watershed before we do our cut lines. So you can see here, it looks like the water is just flowing over to the edge, spilling over and into this other field. And that's not actually what's happening. We do see that we can now put a cut line here. And this is a better example of that. So we can see here, it looks like there are some water flow paths, maybe some ditches right here that goes underneath the road. If we're just looking at LiDAR data, this is going to look like a blockage in how water is flowing. But we know that this is probably likely a culvert location. So we can make a cut in our digital elevation model to make sure that water is still flowing through here as it was intended. Our next step in the ACPF, so once we have our water flow paths going the way that we think looks accurate, and again, this is where that hydrology experience is really going to come in handy. Then we can think about where are streams, and are they perennial streams or non-perennial flows? So here, just matching it up with aerial imagery, it looks like this is a perennial stream, so we always have water flowing here. These are areas where the ACPF will put riparian buffers. So they'll put something along the stream edge to say that this should be covered. It should be like a final treatment or final stop before pollutants enter the waterway by putting that riparian buffer there. Whereas this is non-perennial flow. And so since this is non-perennial, ACPF might recommend that something like grass waterway would go here. But we wouldn't want to put riparian buffers with trees right in the middle of the field. From experience, the first time I ran ACPF, I didn't do this stuff. I didn't realize that I needed to do this, and I ran everything as a perennial stream, and I think it took about 24 hours of the tool running before I finally contacted my advisor and said something is wrong. I don't think I did something right. And we figured out my mistake, but this is a very important step. The next step is field characterization. So we're looking at biofield slope statistics, thinking about if the field is tile drained or not. And again, this is looking at some hydrology data from the soils layer to determine if that's a field that's likely going to be tile drained or not. The distance to the stream, and it uses those as a runoff risk assessment. So if it's a field that's not tile drained, but it's really close to the stream, and it has a really high slope, we might assume that it has a higher runoff risk assessment or higher runoff risk. And that's what the ACPF is doing. So here's an example of some fields in Iowa that were identified as either not drained or yes, they were likely drained based on their hydrology, the hydrology attributes of their soil, and then some non-agricultural fields. And then here's that same area looking at the runoff risk. So these orange are very high runoff risk, and then high, moderate, and low runoff risk areas. Next, it'll move into the precision conservation practice siting. So those are those structural practices. Here in light blue, this is kind of hard to see, but I have the area flow network, which is just fancy word for the water flow through the landscape. So this is likely a perennial stream right here. And this is more of a non-perennial flow or maybe an ephemeral flow. And so you can look at what happens, and I'm only keeping a few practices on here. These red areas are where ACPF has said a grass waterway might be a good opportunity there. And these blue areas are where a contour buffer strip might come in handy because this is a high sloped area that is draining to either side of these flow networks. The next step is impoundment siting. So these are thinking about farm ponds, wasp cobs or nutrient removal wetlands. So here's an example of how all of this flow is moving together. There's a couple areas where wasp cobs could go. And then the ACPF has said that this might be a good opportunity for nutrient removal wetland. And here's where the buffered area should be for that nutrient removal wetland. And here's a wetland that was installed in Story County a few years ago. Finally, the riparian assessment. So I said that this is kind of the last stop when you think about watershed planning. The riparian area is kind of the last stop to make sure that we're catching those pollutants before they get into the stream. Here we can see everywhere along that perennial flow, the ACPF is placing a riparian buffer. And it's working pretty well because it looks like these farmers have already installed riparian buffers along their land. We can see that underneath the trees. And the riparian will also, or ACPF will also add a function tool. So some areas are critical. Some areas would be really good to have deep-rooted vegetation. Some we recommend a multi-species buffered. And this is also where we can look at, would this be a good location for a saturated buffer or not? And then finally, this is the newest tool, which is the Soil Vulnerability Index. And this looks at a new way to look at runoff risk and leaching risk. And this was developed, the Soil Vulnerability Index was, I believe, the USDA, maybe Gregg can correct me if I'm wrong, was a recent USDA model that came out and then has since been added to the ACPF so that people can use that as a new way to look at runoff risk or leaching risk in a watershed. And you can do that by map unit or by pixel of that GCIRCO data. So we mentioned that ACPF is not an outcomes estimation tool, but one of the companion tools and the tool that I worked with the most frequently is the financial nutrient reduction tool. This is currently only available in Iowa and Minnesota, although Illinois should be published fairly soon. But what this tool does is uses ACPF output, so uses those opportunity locations for practices and estimates the nitrogen loss reduction with and without those practices by using estimated fertilizer recommendations for that specific crop. And then it also thinks about the cost of implementing that practice in the field. So in this way, we can see that we are getting an outcome of expected nitrogen loss and also an economic cost of what that practice might cost. But this is really cool because it'll say this exact contour buffer strip, if you place it here, based on the land rent, based on the length and the width, expected width of this contour buffer strip, this is how much it should cost. And if you have a farmer who only wants to implement one contour buffer strip, you can use the fine art tool to identify which contour buffer strip might be the best economic sense, or which one might reduce the most nitrogen. And you're able to get a cost effectiveness for nitrate removal using this. So you can really focus on the watershed or on the practices that would be the most cost effective. So this is a way to help prioritize practice to increase cost effectiveness. And it can also estimate some non-structural, non-ACPF practices like cover crops and tillage. And this is just an example table of the type of information that we can look at here. So these, the researcher Emma, she was looking at a couple different scenarios. So if she were to implement all the wetlands in this watershed, here's the total cost, and it would reduce about, or each pound of nitrate would be about $24, or each kilogram of nitrate would be about $24 to remove. Whereas she only looked at cover crops, it'd be about $13 per kilogram of nitrate removed. She was only using cover crops. And then you can do this to kind of mix and match practices across the watershed to see what would be the most effective and cost effective. Another new companion tool is the manure map toolbox. This was just released with version 6, I think a couple months ago, or maybe even a couple weeks ago. And this was developed by Sarah Porter at University of Minnesota, and with help from Dave James at he's at Iowa State. This estimates manure disposal pressure using animal feedlot locations and the nearby cropland area. So each of these black dots is an animal feeding operation, and here's the size of the circle increases with the expected manure. So with this, you will need to get state level or even county level data of how many animal units are in that animal feeding operation, and then what the expected manure loss is from there. But then you can see if you were to spread manure just based on the end removal rate, how far out from that animal feeding operation would you need to go to apply all of the manure that was created in that facility based on the animal units that were supposed to be in that facility? If we're looking at the nitrogen fertilizer rate, so applying all the nitrogen manure to meet all the nitrogen fertilizer requirements, that those fields are, even more fields are receiving manure. And if we're looking at the phosphorus removal rate, we see even more fields are receiving manure. And in some cases, we're likely overlapping fields or having fields that having locations of manure and enough manure that we probably don't have enough fields to spread them on. I think it's generally about 4 miles of hauling manure. You can haul manure about 4 miles before it's not cost effective anymore. And so this was a lot of information. As Anne talked about earlier, there is the ACPF hub, there's the user's manual, and there's a lot of resources available. And I think Anne's gonna go into a few more of those training resources. But one thing you can also do is join the ACPF forum. So this is a Google group where people can ask questions and users will help each other answer questions. And if people are still having problems, then Dave James, who is one of the original creators of the tool, he usually comes in and helps pretty quickly. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Anne.
Yeah, thanks. So I know Haleigh talked a little bit about what goes into it, and if you're just getting started, it can seem daunting. So we've been lucky to put together quite a few resources. Haleigh mentioned the forum and the user's manual. On our website, there is a resource library, and on there you can find best practices tips. There's actually like a knowledge base where you can look up common questions on the forum and get those answered if you're running into common issues, or technical how-to videos, or even like guides to making landscape specific adaptations. Next slide. I do want to mention that we have ongoing trainings as well. So we have, actually this summer, we're having a technical training for those that want to learn how to use the ACPF and ArcGIS. That's actually starting August 5th, and you can find that information or sign up on our website. We also have an ongoing training that you can take. It's hosted via Canvas, and it's asynchronous, so you can take it at your own time and learn how to go through the different settings. But we also have a lot of resources that are directly related to watershed management and how to use the ACPF in that. Next slide, Haleigh. So there is case studies and use examples. Joe, I saw your message. We actually have a use example that we wrote up on Root River. So if you go to our resource library and click use examples, you'll see all of those that we have. We have a user's guide that's actually just for field staff, just for non-technical staff. We have tips for using ACPF with stakeholders. I showed the graphic that we have on how ACPF can fit into EPA's 9-step key element plans. We also have one on how it fits into NRCS workflows, both area-wide and farm scale. So lots of different resources there. And we actually are having a watershed planning training. These are free virtual trainings, July 29th. So if it is something that you're interested in learning how to use ACPF outputs, that's a 3-part. It's on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it's a Zoom meeting later this summer. So we can I'll give Jen the link to put in the chat for that. Okay, that was rapid fire, but I want to make sure we have enough time for Gregg.
Okay, I'm Gregg Hadish. I'm going to go through the last section here and looking at how within NRCS we're utilizing some of the results from the ACPF runs. I'm the state GIS specialist for NRCS in Iowa, so we provide support to all 100 of our field offices and area staff and anything related to GIS or GPS and field data collection. So we operate, we have a small team at the state office in Des Moines and provide that support for those folks out in the field. My background, I have a degree from Iowa State University in landscape architecture. Okay, this is a slide we saw earlier, and it's showing where the ACPF, the results watersheds are available. And one thing I just wanted to clarify here, the ACPF has been run on many, many more areas other than what's just shown on blue on this map. This is showing what data is freely available through the national ACPF hub. So these are map services that are out there in the public realm where anybody can utilize that data. So currently there's HUCs in services in 12 different states, and many more are being added as they go along. So the staff working at the hub at Iowa State are actually curating this data and looking at it, reviewing it prior to putting it up in a service that becomes available. So that's what we're looking at. Within each of those blue areas, if you zoom in on it, you can actually click on the feature, click on one of the HUC 12s and find out where's this data coming from. So it'll tell you the source of the entities who ran the data. It tells you what version of the ACPF tool was used to do it and some contact information. So it's important if you do want to utilize data that someone else has prepared, kind of knowing the background on it is important. So you can actually follow up with those folks and find out more information if you need it. Okay, so looking at how this data is out there and provided, these are map services that are hosted on ArcGIS Online. So it's a cloud-based system that we can tap into utilizing our different GIS tools, and basically make a link to talk to these data sets that are out there. So many of the services that Haleigh, or many of the data sets that Haleigh was just showing us, are available as a map service. And I've got the full list there. So both the structural practices, some of the field-based information, all of that is available as a map service. So again, we're within NRCS, we're utilizing it in a couple of different ways, and I'll be getting into that in more detail. But just so you know, we can pull the data sets in that are out as services directly into our own ArcGIS Pro session, or utilize it within some of our other tool sets. And one of those tools is called the Conservation Desktop, that many of you may have heard of. This is our internal tool set that we use when we're working one-on-one with our customers, our farmers, folks that are coming in to establish conservation plans on their property. So the tool itself, we can configure to provide different map layers so that our staff can look at those things. And so what I'm showing here on this slide is just all the individual ACPF results map layers, everything from bioreactors, contour buffer strips, on down the line, farm ponds. All of those are available as individual map layers. And so when our field staff are looking at it and they're working one-on-one with the customer, we don't have to look at the full suite of everything that's been produced in an ACPF watershed, but we can toggle things off and on that are specific to their needs, what the client is asking for. This is just a little more background stuff that we do to sort of fine-tune where our field staff can have access to this data. We can tune it down to individual service centers where there's actual data available. We can always add those folks if new data becomes available. And it can also be shared out within the different states where data is available as well. So we're just sort of a tool to fine tune which offices can utilize that data, where data is available. So now getting into Conservation Desktop, the mapping features within that Conservation Desktop allow us to look at data at different scales. So the slide we're looking at here, we can see data showing, for example, all the grass waterways and farm ponds at that full Huck 12 scale. Of course, when we're doing the conservation planning at the field scale, then we can zoom in and look. And again, as I mentioned before, we can just toggle on the features that the particular farmer might be interested in establishing on their property. So here we're seeing just, again, in this case, some wasp cobs and grassed waterways. So conservation planning within Conservation Desktop, this tool itself actually operates as a document management system, a mapping system, a planning tool. All these things are sort of incorporated into Conservation Desktop. So once we're working with an individual client, individual landowner, farmer, we're opening up their folder and establishing the practice schedules, everything that goes into the conservation plan. So this is where we would be able to utilize those ACPF results as a reference layer. First of all, in that early stages of, okay, what would you like to do on this particular piece of property? And a lot of folks obviously are already going to have ideas that maybe they're coming in and saying, yeah, I'm really interested in doing a contour buffer strip. And that's where we can begin that conversation starter that Haleigh was talking about, to say, well, here are some potential areas within that field that we could look at contour buffer strips. So again, not only within Conservation Desktop, which is a web-based tool that we use within our offices, our staff also have access to full-fledged desktop GIS, and we use ArcGIS Pro for that. What this allows us to do is not only utilize the layers that are in Conservation Desktop, but any other GIS data set that we want to utilize in terms of looking at the ACPF data along with other map layers, things like soils, other imagery, other elevation data. What it allows us to do is to go into more detailed GIS analysis using things like the geoprocessing tool sets that are within ArcGIS Pro. So it sort of takes it a step further, and we could be looking at maybe for a full watershed scale type planning operation. We can do that within ArcGIS Pro. We also can utilize those same services that I showed at the beginning with the other apps, so things like web applications. If we're putting together information that we want to get out to partners or other entities, we can put it in a form of a web app and serve up those map layers as well. So this could be for maybe internally we're doing something, or externally with a public organization, let's say. And you can view the data sets in a really kind of a stripped down GIS, if you will. So just showing things like base map imagery and LiDAR along with the ACPF results information to kind of tell the story of what we can do with this information. What can we do with the ACPF results data? Another tool that we use within our field offices is called ArcGIS Field Maps, and this is a mobile device-based application that talks to those same map services. But what's a little different here is that we can go to the field working one-on-one. Maybe we're doing a walkthrough or a walkover with a farmer, looking at potential siting locations, utilizing that ACPF results data. So we could be standing out on a corner of a field with the farmer and saying, this is where we're at, and this is where an example where we could put a wasp cob or grass waterway or whatever practice they would be looking at. So it makes for a nice way of sort of field checking, how did the model do in terms of the data it was using? What does that look like when we're actually in the field? So sort of field checking. And then what we can also do is map new features while we're in the field as well. So maybe we want to tweak where a particular location of a conservation practice is. We can add new point, line, and polygon features right within the application, and then bring that back into the office and utilize that in our ongoing conservation planning process. Okay, so I think Anne was going to talk about a few other things here.
Yeah, well, this is just the wrap up before we have some questions. Just a little bit of, bringing it all together about ACPF is that really no matter the context, if it's in an agricultural watershed, ACPF can be used to meet goals. And it's really something that can be used in multiple ways, whether it's engaging stakeholders or starting conversations or determining strategically where you should focus and which landowners you should reach out to, or if you have one landowner and you're deciding what solutions to make on a field scale, like which areas to focus on, or really for so many of us in watershed planning, really it can help transition from that demonstration and planning process to implementation, which we often know is where it gets really mucky in there and can be complicated. So just a little bit more about ACPF. Not an outcomes estimation tool, but one that we added on, an outcomes estimation tool for several states. And then Greg, if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to provide our contact information for each of us. And I know we've been putting some links in there. ACPF 4, the number 4 watershed.org is really the website of the hub. And we have a lot on there in terms of resources, training information. It's a publicly available tool. So downloading the tool and seeing where it has been run, if it's been run in your area. Thanks for having us today, Aysha and Jen.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I do know that there were 2 questions in the Q&A, which it looks like Haleigh has answered both of them. But for the attendees that did not see them, if you go to the Q&A, you can look under answered. So the first question was, is there a publication or website we can look to for more detailed information about the Root River watershed case study? And so Haleigh did put in a link to that. And then the other question was, with potential changes to the landscape from year to year, how long is the data or models with ACPF considered accurate? Haleigh, I know that you answered this through typing, but do you want to also say it out loud for so we have it in the recording?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question because landscape changes do change quite often. This is what I meant when I said, you want to make sure your field boundaries are updated. You want to use the most accurate cropland data layer or the most up-to-date cropland data layer. Most often we're seeing field boundaries and land use data change year to year. We're not often seeing in the other 2 layers or 3 layers, I guess, the USGS watershed boundaries. I don't think those are updated very frequently, maybe once every 10 years. I don't know, Greg, do you know that? How often USGS updates those watershed boundaries?
Yeah, once they've been established, it's fairly unusual to have a change unless there's a new data set that comes along, like higher resolution LiDAR, that they might be remapping some of those. But for the most part, those are fairly static. We do have updated Surgo data every year. NRCS has new data for that. But as you mentioned, the field boundaries and LiDAR elevation data sets do change as well. That would be recording changes that are happening in the landscape. And here in Iowa, we have 2 different flights, one that was done in around 2010 and another done about 2021. So that changes, or the data that's available is less frequent, but it does change.
Yeah. And so another thing that I mentioned in this answer, and thanks for that, Greg, the most of the time that you're running ACPF, most of that 40 to 50 hours is going to be processing that digital elevation model. The nice thing is once you've done it once, you can use that. You should double check all of your cut lines and your dam lines, but you can use that in future versions. So if you started that with the 2010 digital elevation model, and you want to use it on the 2020 digital elevation model if you're in Iowa, then you could reuse those cut lines and dam lines and just making sure that those are still in the correct spots. And you might have to do some small tweaking and adjustment from that. But so my long answer short to this question is you could rerun the ACPF fairly easily as your field boundaries are updated and as your land use is updated once you have done the pre-processing of the digital elevation model and identifying your perennial stream earlier on. And so it's pretty easy to rerun it once you've already had it run once.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming through at the moment. We'll give it a couple more minutes. We're near the end anyway. And so just for clarification, say, somebody's on the call that the ACPF has not been run in their area. what are the processes that they would need to go through to just, quickly, how would they get started in doing that?
So I would check and see if they're in an area that has core data. So if they are, then they can download that core data from the ACPF website. If they're not in an area that has core data, then it's going to be a little bit more extra time to find to grab their Surgo data. So using that watershed boundary, getting their field boundaries, which is probably going to be the most time consuming if their state doesn't already have a field boundary layer that they could use, or editing and updating those field boundaries. And then they'll need to find a digital elevation model. Some states make those really easy to find, like Iowa. Some states are a little bit more challenging to find those high resolution DEMs.
Okay, and then once they have done that preliminary work, can their work then become available for others to use within ACPF, or okay?
Yep. So then they would, I think it's, did they email it in? And do you know? I know there's a process for how to get your data into the ACPF and action map.
Yeah, so we have a website. On the website is the submit your results data, provide your results data. It is basically emailing it in, but we have it. You submit your data to the reports.
Great.
Yeah.
And all of those data are verified by folks at the ISU GIS facility to make sure that they are accurate. They look like they were run appropriately.
Perfect. Thank you.
One thing I'll add to what Haleigh was just talking about, if you are downloading some raw data to utilize within the model, there are toolboxes within the ACPF tool set within ArcGIS Pro that help you get it in the right format that's the tool needs to run. So there's a utilities, I believe it's under a utilities toolbox on there.
Yeah.
So that helps with a lot of the processing side of things.
Fantastic. All right. Well, since we don't have any other questions coming through, I will go ahead and take over the screen. Okay. Did not start me out with my last. All right. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. And here are some next steps in our collective outcomes quantification journey. So first, we encourage you to bookmark the Outcomes Estimation Tools Training Webinar Series Farmland Information Center page link that we shared earlier, and share it with your colleagues as well. So that's going to be our long-term website that houses all of the webinar recordings and the PDFs that I was talking about earlier. And also in the following weeks, we'll be adding a PDF with a collection of the summary snapshots tables and the strength and limitation slides for each of the 15 presentations that we've had, to make it easier for you to compare and contrast each of the tools to find the right tool for your project. Second, at the end of the webinar, please share your feedback with us by answering that quick 6-question survey. A link was shared at the beginning of the session, and it'll also appear as a new tab in your internet browser when the webinar ends. Take a couple minutes to share your feedback so we can use your suggestions in future events. And don't forget that you will be entered into a drawing for a gift card just for filling out the survey. So we thank you in advance for your participation, and good luck. Also, Michelle and I are still offering the free coaching services to farm project managers who secure a session with us. These sessions are individually tailored to you in order to help you figure out which tools or methods are right for your project. And if you're interested, just email me, Aysha Tapp Ross, and in the subject line, write coaching request. And we also encourage you to download a PDF of the Outcomes Estimation Tools Guide, which this webinar series is based on. And we are posting a link to that in the chat as well. Please join us at the Soil and Water Conservation Society Annual Conference in Myrtle Beach later this month for a deep dive into the cumulative poll and survey results as well as potential changes in outcomes tools reporting in the EPA's grants reporting and tracking system, GRITS, or just to say hi. So we encourage you to stop by our talk. And finally, please let us know if there are any other ag environmental webinar series you would like to see AFT organize in the future. We are always open to suggestions for further projects. So thank you again for your participation, and we thank you all for joining us through this webinar series.